So, hello, salam. Let me start off by saying what an honor and a privilege it is to be presenting this material to you. You are helping the Iranian people deal with the many forms of trauma that they are subject to. And I'm very excited to bring you some of the latest developments in the field of trauma. It is my hope that together we can work to reduce suffering and increase resilience to oppression. So the title of this talk is A Somatic Approach to Trauma. So what do we mean by somatic? That's what I'm going to start by addressing. The term somatic comes from the Greek word soma, which means body, as opposed to the word psyche, as in psychotherapy, which means mind. But the somatic approach does not mean attending to the body instead of the mind. Instead, the somatic approach rejects the dualistic view that separates body and mind. This view is called Cartesian dualism after the French philosopher René Descartes. This belief is very deeply rooted in the Western worldview. And it says that mind and body are two completely different realms, which have a problematic relationship, the so-called mind-body problem. This distorted view is at the root of many of the shortcomings of Western culture. In psychology, this view has led to a broad neglect of body sensation, movement, and the functioning of the autonomic nervous system in psychological states. And this has greatly limited the ability of psychotherapists to deal with certain states, certain issues, trauma being one of the foremost. Now, recent developments in many fields are challenging this Cartesian framework, but it is still very deeply entrenched in Western thought. Even the term psychosomatic suggests that there is a psyche and a soma, a mind and a body that have some kind of mutual influence. This is not the somatic view. So this whole movement of challenging the Cartesian dualism, this has become known as the somatic approach. Now, there's several different currents converging in the West, different currents of thought to create this new field of somatics. One of them is the spread of traditional Asian spiritual and body-mind practices, such as yoga, Tai Chi, Buddhist meditation, and Sufism. You probably know that Rumi is now the most popular poet in the world. So all these systems are adopt very much of a somatic point of view and challenge that mind-body dualism. Another current of thought is the development of native Western systems based in the body, but fully recognizing the fundamental role of the body in our whole way of being in the world. Systems such as the Alexander technique, the Feldenkrais method, and Rolfing. Collectively, these are referred to as forms of somatic education. And a third current comes from the work of controversial psychoanalyst Wilhelm Reich. He was a student of Freud's, and he had the insight that neurotic patterns of behavior were locked into the system through a pattern of bodily restriction, muscular tension, that he referred to as character armor. So his radical insights have led to the development of a number of schools of somatic psychotherapy. So these three currents, together with the fact that modern neuroscience completely supports the somatic perspective. These four factors together have led to the formation of this new field, the somatic approach. Now, I mentioned that modern neuroscience really supports the somatic approach. And for our purposes here, understanding the brain, understanding some things about the brain is very important. Modern neuroscience shows us that the brain is one single complex system where bodily, emotional, and mental experience arise in an inherently integrated way. There's no separation between body and mind in the brain. So for our topic, it's useful to understand something about the structure of the brain. So the brain has a layered structure, okay, with more recent parts built on previous parts. Very broadly speaking, and this is a big generalization, primitive survival processes are dealt with, are organized at the deepest level of the brain, in the brainstem. Social and emotional processes are organized in the limbic system and midbrain. And language, thought, and of volitional movement are organized at the most surface layer in the neocortex. And all of these levels interact in resonant loops, so they are not separate. Survival instincts, emotional reactions, conceptual beliefs all interact so richly that we can no longer see them as separate areas. Now, in psychotherapy, cognitive therapies, such as cognitive behavioral therapy, use words to explore and restructure faulty beliefs. So this approach can be very useful in some situations, but it has some very severe limitations. The extreme reactions that we see with trauma, as well as addictions, and also depression, anxiety, compulsions, psychosis, show great resistance to verbal and conceptual interventions. You can't talk somebody out of an addiction or a phobia. So this is because these conditions are not limited to the cerebral cortex, where conscious thought and volition are processed, but they actually originate in the brainstem and midbrain survival processes, which are not directly influenced by rational thought. These deeper processes of the brainstem and midbrain follow very, very different rules from the rational mind and cortical processes. So somatic therapies use methods which deal directly with the autonomic nervous system and the midbrain processes, using a very different skill set from traditional psychotherapies. I want to really emphasize that point. Training of a traditional psychotherapist is very, very different from that of a somatic therapist. Even the basic worldview is different between the two. In the somatic approach, we prioritize attention to bodily sensations, embodied feelings and emotions, movement impulses and postures, as opposed to discursive and conceptual verbalizing. In other words, we sense rather than talking about. This approach really makes sense when you think about human development. The first functions to develop in the infant involve movement, gesture, visceral and instinctive activity, bodily sensation, and non-verbal vocalization. These areas form the foundation of personality. Early childhood trauma or neglect impact these basic structures. Later, more nuanced social responses and emotions arise, and complex belief systems and sophisticated concepts come last. But that foundational level has a huge impact and determines a lot of what comes later. So to work directly with these levels, these foundational levels, it is necessary to learn a new language, the language of bodily sensation, movement, gesture, and feeling, which is very different from the language of thoughts, ideas, beliefs, and concepts. So to begin learning this somatic language, we need to understand the autonomic nervous system. So the autonomic nervous system is in charge of the survival of the organism. So this includes both visceral metabolic processes of digestion, respiration, and so forth, but also the capacity to defend against outside threat. So this means that in any situation at any age where a person is significantly threatened, whether by aggression or by deprivation, the autonomic nervous system will be activated. And restoring balance to the autonomic nervous system is therefore central to the healing of any form of distress. Now, until recently, it was thought that the autonomic nervous system just had two parts, sympathetic and the parasympathetic, the fight or flight and rest and digest. But the work of Dr. Stephen Porges has resulted in a new theory, the polyvagal theory, which says that the autonomic nervous system actually has three levels of increasing complexity and sophistication. The first level is the dorsovagal system. So it's a branch of the vagus nerve. It's the subdiaphragmatic branch of the vagus nerve. This system stimulates digestive processes and internal metabolic processes, but behaviorally, it brings about shutdown and immobility. So that could be resting, but in terms of dealing with external threat, it's shutdown and immobility. So like hunkering down, holding your breath, not moving, hiding, and hoping that the predator won't see you. That's the dorsovagal strategy for dealing with threat. Next part of the autonomic nervous system to develop is the sympathetic system. So this is the familiar fight or flight thing. So sympathetic system slows down the digestive and internal metabolic processes, and instead brings all its energy into the musculoskeletal system to be able to fight back or to run away. The strategy becomes mobilization into fight or flight. With the activation of the sympathetic nervous system, one becomes very quick and strong. However, awareness often narrows down to a kind of tunnel vision. Now, the most recently developed system is the ventrovagal system. So this is the supradiaphragmatic vagus and includes the function of various cranial nerves as well. This system supports normal, balanced visceral functioning. And behaviorally, it supports social engagement and clear, open awareness. So in terms of like a strategy for dealing with threat, that would involve, where possible, anticipating and avoiding the threat. Or if the threat involves humans, possibly negotiating the threat. Or connecting and relating to other people to collectively handle the threat, as well as in the company of others to deal with the aftermath of threat and trauma in a way that involves social communication and probably in Iran, many cups of chai. So this is, in evolutionary terms, the most recent to evolve, and of course it's highly evolved in humans. So how does all this apply to trauma and also to other mental emotional problems? So such issues usually tend to begin, often in childhood, with something that feels like an attack or a threat. This could be either a positive attack or the absence of something necessary. So stresses or challenges from the environment like this could be met by a well-functioning adult with open awareness, understanding, and communication and preventive measures of ventrovagal response. Of course, in children, this capacity is still undeveloped, and many forms of threat, such as a car accident, you can't negotiate your way out of a car accident, will prevent this kind of response from happening. So the next level of response, dealing with a challenge or threat, would be sympathetic activation. So the body is mobilized and really comes online to possibly resist, to argue, to leave the situation. If the threat level mounts higher, there's greater and greater activation of the sympathetic nervous system to the point where one may be fighting back in an extreme rage or running for your life in terror. The situation is bad enough that warrants that. If there is a successful handling of the threat, if you succeed in fighting back or running away, then there is a return to baseline. Now, the more extreme the activation is, the more difficult it may be returning to baseline, but usually it won't be all that difficult. And with a little help at calming down, little sympathetic support, usually one can come back pretty well. And such a situation leaves one with a sense of accomplishment, even triumph, a greater sense of agency and capacity. It's like, I did it. I succeeded. I dealt with that threat. It can be a very empowering experience. But we haven't yet talked about trauma. So even extreme rage and terror are not in themselves traumatic as long as you come to a successful resolution of the situation. But here we get to the core of it. If the challenge is very extreme, it's experienced as threatening your physical or psychological integrity, and it's impossible to fight back, it's impossible to escape, then something very different may happen. So it's like a house that has a short circuit in its wiring. What happens? A circuit breaker trips, a fuse blows. That prevents further damage to the wiring, but it shuts down the whole electrical system. So that's what happens in the nervous system. You have this huge activation of the sympathetic system, and it's impossible. It can't work. It can't work. And so now the dorsovagal system, that most primitive shutdown system, suddenly that gets extremely activated, even more strongly than the sympathetic system, and the whole system shuts down. So what does this look like? So it can look like freeze. From extreme activation, suddenly there is immobility. It can be freeze. It could also be collapse. And that could even happen to the extent of loss of consciousness, like fainting or passing out. Another way that could manifest would be as dissociation. So all of a sudden, things feel kind of dreamy and unreal, and the fear and the terror and the anger go away, and everything feels calm and nice, and you're out of touch with reality. Okay. You may even see yourself from outside, see yourself from above, dissociative state. And one other reaction that's worth mentioning is there may be a loss of agency, right? So there's no longer the feeling that you can make decisions on your own, and one may become very compliant. So if the trauma involves other people, one may find oneself being very, very compliant, following directions with a sense of like, I can't initiate anything on my own. Now, it's important to remember, and we'll come back to this later, that underneath this apparent passivity or shutdown, the original intense sympathetic defensive reaction is still present. It hasn't stopped and gone away. It is just masked by the shutdown. It's similar to a car. You see a car that's standing still. You get a little closer, you see that the car is kind of vibrating. Then you realize the man inside, the person inside, has his foot all the way down on the accelerator and on the brake at the same time. So it may look still, but there's really, really intense energies inside. So from this perspective, from this somatic perspective, this is what we mean by trauma. It's that dorsovagal shutdown that comes in and inhibits the intense sympathetic response underneath. Okay. Which means that then trauma is in the nervous system, not in the event. Trauma is, in this view, defined as the nervous system response. So an event itself is not inherently traumatic or non-traumatic. Whether trauma happens depends upon what happens in the nervous system. So there's several things that I'd like to emphasize that we should know about trauma. One is to point out that this reaction has survival value. So in animals, right, if an animal is caught by a predator and we describe it as playing dead, but it's not playing. If it slumps, collapses, or freezes and becomes immobile, the predator may well lose interest. You've seen, like, the way that with a cat and a mouse, if the mouse collapses, goes limp, the cat may well lose interest. You might think like, well, this is a sick animal, or this is no fun to play with anymore, right? Lose interest. Then the mouse can recover. And among animals, that recovery from the shutdown state happens easily and straightforwardly. The mouse may go through a little bit of trembling, something like this, and then return to normal consciousness and take off while the cat's not looking. As we'll see later, for humans, the process is not so simple. Another thing to realize about trauma is that following from this idea that trauma is in the nervous system, not in the situation, different situations are going to be experienced differently by different people. Situation that is traumatic for one person may be actually enjoyable for someone else. Think of bungee jumping, where people attach a long rubber band to themselves and jump off a cliff, right? So I wouldn't do it. And somebody might well get quite traumatized if something like that happened, but people do it for fun. Other examples are like a racing car driver is probably going to be very resilient to car accidents that where with an ordinary person, even a near miss might be traumatic. Military personnel are obviously going to respond completely differently to combat situations than a civilian would, and so on. So one can't, go directly from the situation and assume that that is traumatic. So it's an important thing to remember. Another thing that is important to understand is that this shutdown response is in no way a voluntary choice, right? So sometimes people will blame themselves. They will say, why didn't I fight back? Why didn't I run away? Why did I just freeze? And can feel shame and guilt over that. So it can be very important to understand and to help traumatized people to understand that no, they had no choice. This was the nervous system. This was a deep, deep level of the nervous system, same area of the nervous system that governs the heartbeat, that came in and shut you down. You had no choice in the matter. So let's talk a little bit about the post-trauma state. So, as I've indicated, that shutdown state, people may recover from that spontaneously on their own. In fact, in the majority of cases, people do. But it can also persist indefinitely. There are a number of factors. Depends on the person, depends on their past history, depends on the intensity of the trauma, and also depends very strongly on whether the person got supportive help after the trauma or not. So what does this post-traumatic state, this traumatized state, look like? So it can manifest as passivity, social withdrawal, lack of communication, a depressive kind of state, and again, which can last indefinitely. And it can also look like extreme flashes of rage and terror. Could be a situation in which the rage or terror is quite prolonged, or it could be temporary flashes. Could be associated with what we call flashbacks, where all of a sudden the memory of the traumatic situation surges up into consciousness and it feels like it's happening now. The traumatic experience has not been processed by the brain and put in the compartment that says this is in the past. But instead it comes up and it feels like it's in the present. So all this is very, very disruptive to the traumatized person's ability to function in the world. The whole autonomic nervous system, which of course controls the viscera, has gotten really dysregulated. So this can give rise to seemingly medical issues, such as migraines, irritable bowel syndrome, autoimmune situations, many so-called stress-related diseases, and other medical conditions. So then let's talk about recovery from trauma. So again, the sort of common sense point of view might be that, well, once you're out of the situation, you should be fine. You should be able to recover, just fine. So the crucial point here is what I mentioned before, that under the surface of the shutdown, the tremendous energies of the instinctive defensive response of the sympathetic nervous system are still there. So what that means is that if the shutdown begins to lift, what happens is not a sense of relief and healing, but instead those memories and feelings and nervous system activations surrounding the trauma surge back up into consciousness. And as I said before, may have that quality of like, this is happening right now, this is happening right now. Now, the thing is that this is natural and appropriate because those intense trauma energies need to get discharged. They need to complete themselves in order to resolve the trauma. But this experience, of course, can be profoundly disturbing and even terrifying, especially if it is not understood, which is the point of what I'm explaining to you. So, you know, that whole situation can lead to seemingly paradoxical responses where when you bring calming to a trauma victim, you offer relaxation, meditation, comfort, and safety. The reaction may be terror, rage, or extreme discomfort. So if this reaction is not understood and met well, it can actually lead to greater dysregulation and even more barriers to healing. Friends and well-meaning helpers may be upset, frustrated, or even angry at the trauma victim when their offered comfort is met with anger or fear. This could leave the traumatized person feeling more isolated and unsupported, or even feeling guilty. And it may push them towards suppressing these upsurging energies, which are actually part of the healing process. So how do we behave with somebody in a recovering from a recent trauma? So, of course, it is so important for friends and helpers to be able to offer a truly supportive environment as soon as possible after the trauma-inducing situation is over. This can really help a person to avoid long-term effects from the trauma. So obviously, a good understanding of trauma dynamics is really essential. So a calm, caring presence, of course, is very crucial. One can offer reassurances like, you're safe now, we're here with you. And these reassurances should be congruent with the state of the helper. So if the helper is actually feeling kind of freaked out and scared, and they try to put on a calm face and say, no, no, everything is fine, right? Well, the traumatized person may be very, very sensitive to that. And they may feel a sense of distrust. In that kind of situation, it might be much better for the helper to say, yeah, I'm feeling a little freaked out. I'm kind of scared, but I'm here with you. I'll support you. We'll work through this. So acknowledging authentically what is going on inside as part of the reassurance. And that will actually be more reassuring than the attempts to present a facade of calm. So this obviously points to the importance of helpers being trained in methods of self-regulation. In other words, helpers should be trained to know how to calm themselves, to regulate their own nervous system, to get grounded. There are many somatic techniques that can be learned fairly easily, can be practiced, and can be incredibly helpful in this kind of situation. Another factor in helping somebody after a trauma is to pay careful attention to what will help this particular person. Each person may have different needs depending on their personality and depending on the nature of the trauma. For instance, some people may really want to be held and to have physical contact. Other people may really need space. So it's very important to be aware of that, to listen, to pay attention, even to ask the person, what would you like from us? How can we help you right now? And to listen and pay attention to that. If a person says they need space or they want to be left alone, obviously you don't go away, but you back off, you give them space, you let them know, we're here if you need us. Okay? Now, crying, trembling, shaking, thrashing around may very well be a big part of this trauma recovering process. So it's really important to normalize that. And this understanding that I'm trying to convey can really help with that. So you can say things like, it's okay, it's natural. This is just the trauma leaving your body. And as long as you understand and believe that, then that will really be communicated to the person and make it a lot easier for them to allow this process, this natural biological process, to continue. Now, if the person is like thrashing around so much that they're in danger of hurting themselves, then some degree of gentle restraint may be necessary, but it should only be what is absolutely necessary to prevent injury. And it should be accompanied by that kind of statement, I don't want you to hurt yourself. Because of course, if the person is thrashing around because they were restrained during the trauma, it's very important to be able to let them thrash and let them have that experience of like pushing away. So you have to be very, very careful about restraint. Use cushions, things like that, so that they can't hurt themselves. Now, when it seems appropriate and possible, the person could really be invited to look at the helpers and friends around them, to be able to make eye contact and see a caring, engaged, non-threatening pair of eyes, to see the people caring and supporting them. That can be very, very powerful. That activates the ventrovagal social engagement system, which is one of the most powerful ways of bringing in resource. So let's talk a little now about the role and requirements for a trauma therapist. So the somatic therapist will usually be seeing the traumatized person days or weeks or even years after the traumatic event. But if the person is still feeling traumatized, then it's a good assumption that there is still a huge amount of trauma energy locked in the system. So the primary role of the somatic therapist is to enable the person to safely discharge that locked up trauma energy and allow it to complete itself. This is called biological completion. And really that's the aim of trauma therapy, to enable biological completion and discharge that energy. So how is that done? So, well, first of all, of course, the therapist must provide a safe container. And that means both safe, literally, physically in the environment, but also emotionally. So the therapist must be very familiar and at ease with the outer manifestations of the trauma recovery process. They should be able to be calm and centered and confident and at ease when the person is crying, screaming, thrashing around, even it can involve temporary loss of consciousness, things like this. It's imperative that the therapist not get freaked out by these things happening and be able to convey a sense of like, it's okay, it's fine, everything is going in the right direction. Now, in order to kind of be with the client and to know what's going on with them, the somatic therapist can't rely on words. The client is going to be involved in processes which are at way deeper levels in the brain than the verbal consciousness. So the therapist instead has to be able to sense using a skill that we call somatic resonance. So you can also call it empathy. So that's the ability to sense in your own body in a kind of resonant process, to sense in your own body what's happening in the other person's body. So this is a natural ability that we all have. Some people are better at it than others. And for the somatic therapist, it's very important that that ability be cultivated and trained. Now, another skill that the somatic therapist should have is the ability to guide the client into positive states. In other words, into good, positive feelings in the body, even before the trauma is resolved. Okay. Sometimes it's necessary to provide considerable education to the client in how to achieve and strengthen these positive inner states. It's kind of like if you're going on a difficult journey, you need to make sure you have the resources that you need before you set out on the journey. If we're going to go on the journey of contacting these deep and scary trauma energies, we need to make sure we have the resources to do that. And that means having the ability to make contact with good, positive feelings inside the body. So one should really begin the whole course of therapy in this way. Often the client will come in wanting to dive right into the trauma. Let me tell you about this terrible thing that happened and so forth. It's very important not to go there, and that instead you want to very gently divert the client and help them start by achieving as positive and grounded and balanced a state as possible. An example of a way of doing that is, right at the beginning when the client takes a chair, you could say, how is that chair for you? Is that comfortable? The client could respond, yeah, that feels comfortable. Then the therapist could ask the client, so where do you feel that comfort? What's comfortable about it? And the client might say, well, I sort of feel like it supports my body nicely. It feels like I can relax into the chair. And then the therapist might say, okay, great, let yourself feel that relaxation. What else do you notice happening in your body as you feel that relaxation? And the therapist might be observing that, the client's breathing is maybe calming down a little bit and becoming more abdominal or whatever. So the client might describe that feeling of relaxation as like, well, I kind of noticed that my shoulders feel better too. And so in this kind of way, in a very gentle and subtle way, the client is guided into contacting positive emotional state. There are many, many techniques of self-soothing, grounding, strengthening boundaries, and so forth that can be taught. The best way of teaching that is to skillfully link this to things that the client is already familiar with. So you might ask the client, so what do you enjoy? What do you do in your life that you really enjoy? And the client might say, well, I really like knitting, right? So the therapist might say, so tell me about that. What does that feel like for you when you're knitting? The client might say, well, you know, all my thoughts about my worries and stuff go away, and I just feel very calm. The therapist might observe, as the client says this, that their body is in fact calming a little bit. They may be settling a little bit. And if the therapist sees that or senses that, right, using that somatic resonance, right, they might direct the client's attention towards that. Let yourself notice that pleasant, calm feeling that comes as you recall knitting. What else do you notice about that? The client might say, yeah, I do feel a lot calmer. It's a very pleasant state. So in that way, you are cultivating and strengthening positive inner states. Now, that's not enough, right? That's not going to heal the trauma, but it's a necessary preparation. So after preparing in that way, then when the therapist starts to help the client to access the trauma energies, the difficult stuff, okay, it's got to be one little bit at a time. So this is called titration. That comes from a term in chemistry where if you have two substances like an acid and a base, that if you just mix them together, there'll be this big explosion. You do it drop by drop, one little drop, one little drop. And each drop may go in and go, psh, little explosion, but it's manageable. You keep on doing that, pretty soon you can add a little more. And then eventually the last, I don't know, half of the jar, you can just pour that in, it's fine. So that basic idea that the therapist has the skill to enable the client to take one little tiny bit of the trauma, that will trigger those defensive energies, but just a little bit at a level that is easily manageable and not overwhelming. So then those defensive energies will come up, and there may be some, you know, trembling or shaking or a little bit of distress, but something easily manageable. And then that kind of works its way through and subsides. And then there's like a return to baseline, a sense of a little bit of relief, a little bit of calmness, connecting back again to positive sensations. And now we can do another drop, another little bit. Okay. That continues. Each time you resolve a little bit of the trauma, you gain a little bit more capacity. So now you can take on a somewhat bigger chunk. And eventually you get to a point where now you're ready to confront the core of it, you know, the really, really difficult part, and to allow the core of those biological energies to be expressed, to come out. And often what will happen is it'll come out in the way of completing itself. So one example is somebody in a car accident who is not able to turn the wheel may have the experience of like, oh, I'm able to turn the wheel. So there'll be that sense of biological completion. Now, I did want to just mention that this is a significant criticism of psychotherapeutic trauma techniques that involve either exposure therapy or debriefing, in which the person is like confronted with the trauma and encouraged to face it and go through it again and again and again until there's no more charge. What can all too often happen with that is that the person actually goes into the shutdown state. So it may look like there's no more charge, but what's really happened is they've gotten re-traumatized and have shut down. So the somatic approach uses the titration take it one little manageable bit at a time. So that's a very, very important part of it. Now, I mentioned already that, like, when you successfully negotiate a trauma, a challenging situation, there's a sense of increased agency and capacity. So it's the same with trauma therapy, that when you successfully go through this process and allow those energies to complete themselves successfully, there's the feeling of having successfully dealt with something. There's an increased sense of agency, an increased sense of confidence and capacity. And this is called post-traumatic growth. The person is now actually more able to handle things. The nervous system is more resilient, has more possibilities. And very importantly, the person is now more able to help others who have gone through similar situations. So very important. Now, I just want to mention one more thing. We don't have time to go into this in any kind of detail, but I think it's important to mention. So far, we've talked about trauma as being located in space and time. So the trauma happened then, and now it's not happening any longer. But what about those situations where the trauma is ongoing? It hasn't stopped. So that could include situations of like social trauma, like racism, sexism, gender, and political oppression, where one may still be in that cultural situation where there is the potentially traumatic event. So there's just 2 points that I want to make here. One is that it's really important to validate the person's perception that there's something wrong. There's something wrong in society. There's some way that society is impacting me and affecting me that is an attack. So that should be validated. It's like, yes, you are perceiving correctly. You are not crazy. You're not making things up. You're not overly sensitive. You're perceiving correctly and accurately. The second thing follows along from the idea that I've already explained, that trauma is in the nervous system reaction. It's not in the external situation. So the external situation can be genuinely very challenging, but as to whether trauma arises depends on your nervous system. And yes, some situations, nobody can prevent themselves from getting traumatized by it. But in other situations, one can learn to become more resilient to this particular challenge. So there are techniques and practices that enable one to become a lot more resilient to the social challenges and to have a greater chance of being able to maintain nervous system balance, which also means that one is going to be able to handle those challenging situations more effectively, more effective way. Now, it's important to remember that this does not mean that a person is to blame for their traumatic reaction to a situation. We don't have any control at a given point in time as to whether we react with trauma or not. So it is in no way to be interpreted as something that blames people for their traumatic reaction. It's just that there are ways of training to increase resilience and to diminish the chance of a traumatic reaction. In the future, we might possibly be able to offer some trainings along those lines. We do have some materials that can be used for this, but that's for some time in the future. So to end with, I would like to share a frustration of mine as well as a hope for the future. So my frustration is that with all this information, that's not going to enable you to be a somatic therapist. These skills can't be acquired through understanding. Okay? It's a good step in that direction, but actual somatic training is needed in order to acquire these skills. And my hope for the future is that through the Kian Foundation, with the help of Anaita, Mashid, and Mina, we are considering the possibility of offering an actual training course. It would probably be a 4-month training course that would actually give you these skills. So we have a hope for the future that this may become possible, perhaps with your support and cooperation. So it's been really an honor and a delight for me to have this opportunity to share all this with you. Thank you so much for your participation and attendance.